Hello, Twitch chat. This is Rob Windsor, and welcome to my inaugural stream here on Twitch. This stream for me is really to sort of kick the tires on Twitch and make sure I've got my setup all correct and the processes I need to be able to do a Twitch stream. But obviously, some content is important, so I'm going to be talking about SharePoint and Azure Functions. And how we can consume Azure Functions from a SharePoint Framework web part. So let me just switch over to my screen here. I wrote this blog post series recently. It's a 3-part series on working with SharePoint and Azure Functions. And in this blog post series, I created an Azure function that uses app permissions. So the permissions are granted to the app, and the permissions of the user aren't really taken into account. And actually, let me put the link to the first part of the series into the chat here, and you can get the links to the other 2 posts in the series here in the top of the post. So what I wanted to do recently was, now that I've had a little bit of time over the holiday break, was to figure out how I can do something similar, but instead of using app permissions, I want to use delegated permissions. So basically, the permissions of the user would flow through from the SharePoint Framework web part to the Azure function. And I'm just looking at my OBS here, and maybe I found the first kink in the whole process is that I haven't been recording any audio. That would be not good. Is anybody chat can just type in whether they can hear me or not? Okay. Let's see how I can try to fix this. Let me just try this here. Check, check. Okay, so I do have audio. My apologies for the little delay there. Again, I'm just getting used to OBS Studio, and right now it's not showing that my audio is being picked up, but obviously it is, so that's cool. All right, so getting back to the content, really my goal here is to kind of go through the process of showing you how to build an Azure function that uses delegated authentication, and then building a SharePoint Framework web part that consumes that Azure function. I just really kind of got through the process of building this recently, so there's some things that I still need to kind of work out, but hopefully there'll be enough content here where you'll get the gist of what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over to here and go to one of my tenants and go to the Azure portal. And we'll start out by creating the Azure Function app, which will be the host for the Azure function we'll be consuming from our SharePoint Framework web part. So I'll click Create a Resource. And then in the Compute section, we can choose a Function app. This is an Azure Function app. And I'm going to use my pay-as-you-go subscription. I want to create a new resource group, and I'll call this Azure Function App Test 008. Sorry. Well, let me just go through this process. I've actually already created this. I'd forgotten that I'd done that, but we'll go with 009 here. Let me just copy that to the clipboard and click OK. That's going to be the name of my Azure Function app. So Azure Function App Test 009. It's going to ask me to create a runtime stack. So basically, you can create Azure functions that use C# code, TypeScript with Node.js, or JavaScript, Python, Java, or PowerShell. We're actually going to be using the .NET Framework, not .NET Core. But for the purposes of this dialog, we'll pick .NET Core. And I'll explain to you why we are using the full .NET Framework in a little bit. And then I'll pick a region. Here we'll go with East US. And then I'll choose Next. Now we need to create a storage account. So again, I'll choose Create New. And this needs to be a short name that only uses lowercase letters. So generally I'll do azfunc test and 009 to match the name of the Azure function. We want Windows. I'm going to use the consumption plan, meaning that I'm only charged as I actually use the Azure functions. And we want application insights. So there we're good. And now I could go click review and create. Now the process of actually creating the Azure function app takes a minute to 2 minutes. It's not super long, but I don't really want to sit here and watch that spin. So I've already created an Azure function app that we can go ahead and use. And it's just basically, I just went through the same steps that I just showed you. So I can go to all resources here. And I can go find Azure Function App Test 008. And here is the overview for our Azure Function app. And there are no functions currently inside the function app. So there's a few things I need to do to set up to make sure this works as we want it to. So I'm going to go to, the first thing I'm going to do is go to Platform Features and then go to Function App Settings here. And I need to change the runtime version to version 1. So there's 3 versions. Version 1 uses the, if you're doing C# code, uses the full .NET framework. Runtime version 2 and version 3 both use .NET Core. I believe version 2, it's .NET Core 2.2, and version 3, which the last time I checked was in preview, uses .NET Core 3 or 3.1. I can't remember which one exactly. Now, the reason why we need to use 1 is because we're going to be interacting with SharePoint using the client object model, and currently there's no .NET Core version of the client object model. So that's why we need to use version 1 of the runtime version 1, so we can use the full .NET framework. Now, were I to choose to instead use the REST API to communicate with SharePoint, or use the Microsoft Graph API to communicate with SharePoint, then I could actually use the .NET Core versions because those would be supported. But for this example, we're going to use the client object model, which again requires that we use the runtime version 1. All right, so that's the first thing. The second thing I need to do is configure cores here so that I can make calls to my Azure function from my SharePoint tenant. So I'll just grab the URL, the domain name actually, to my SharePoint tenant, and I'll come back here and add that into one of the allowed calling domains, and then click Save. And the next thing I need to do is to configure the authentication, because we're going to be using delegated authentication. So I need to configure that. So I'm going to now, again, under Platform Features, choose Authentication and Authorization here. And I'm going to turn authentication on. So by default, it's anonymous. And I'm going to say that when users try to consume this Azure function, that I'm going to require that they log in with Azure AD. And then now I need to go and configure that. And actually, the portal will do basically all the configuration for me. So I'm going to choose Express here. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a new Azure AD app registration with the same name as my Azure app, function app. Now, that's not required, but I use that pattern. That way it's easy to match up which Azure AD app goes with the Azure function app. And I'll just go ahead and click OK, and then click Save to create the new Azure AD app registration. So now that that's done, I'll go open another tab here and navigate to my Azure portal. And then I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory. And then go to App Registrations. And we should see now under All Applications that we have Azure Function App Test 008. So this is the Azure Function App Registration that just got created. And we're eventually going to need the client ID. We don't need it right now. And we're also going to need a client secret. So that's the first thing I'll create. I'll go to Certificates and Secrets here on the left-hand nav. And I'm going to create a new client secret. And I'll name this Never, let's try that again. Never expires. And I'll say that this never expires and click Add. So there's my client secret that I've just created. I only get to see this one time, so as soon as I navigate off this page, it'll be like this other one here, which is marked as hidden. So at this point, I'll go ahead and copy that client secret, and I'll just come over here to a notepad that I have open. This is a client secret from another app that I created, and I'll just go ahead and paste that in there. So that's my client secret. All right, so that's one thing we need here in our Azure App Registration. And the other thing we need to do is say that the permissions that are going to be requested by this Azure app are permissions to go and read information out of SharePoint site collections. So I'm going to go over here to API permissions, and I'm going to say add a permission. And we could do this through the Microsoft Graph, but I'm going to do it using client object model. So I want to come down here and pick SharePoint for this particular example. And as I mentioned, I want delegated permissions. So these are permissions that are delegated to the current user. So I'll choose that. And then under all sites, in this case, I just want to read. So I'm just going to choose all sites.read. If I wanted to be able to contribute to lists and libraries, that kind of stuff, I could choose write. And if I want to be able to create lists and libraries or subsites, I could choose manage here. But I'll just choose read and click add permissions. And the next thing I need to do is consent the permission requests. So we'll see how that's normally done with SharePoint Framework web parts. But in this case, this is not the same Azure app that's used by the SharePoint Framework web parts. So I need to actually go ahead and consent that permission. Now this Spinny, for some reason, doesn't seem to refresh properly. So if you just go ahead and refresh the page, the button that I need to use to go and do that consent is here. So I'll click that, and it'll ask me what account do I want to use to do the consent. I'll click that, and then the consent dialog will pop up here. And you can see that it's saying, and I'm logged in currently as a tenant admin in this tenant. So it's saying, as a tenant admin, do you want to grant permissions for all users within your tenant based on the permission request made by this Azure app? And I do. So I'll go ahead and click accept. And you can see now that the two permissions, the SharePoint permission, all sites.read, and also the Azure AD permission, excuse me, user.read, have been now granted for all users within this tenant. All right, so that is the configuration of the creation of the Azure Function app, and also the creation and configuration of the associated Azure AD app registration. So at this point, we're ready to go ahead and write some code. So I have Visual Studio 2019 open here. And what I'll do is I'll go to File, New Project. And we want to create an Azure Function project. So I'll select that over here under Recent Project Templates. And then I'll pick the actual project template here and click Next. And just like before, we want to give generally the pattern I use, sorry, excuse me, is to just give the project the same name, especially for test projects, the same name as the function app. Whoops, that's the wrong Visual Studio. So I'll go ahead and do that. And again, for test projects, for me, it's just easier if everything's named the same for me to associate what projects in Visual Studio map to what stuff I have up in Azure. Now again, I'm going to be using the client object model. So I want to make sure that I pick Azure v1 here in terms of the framework supported. And I'm just going to choose and create an empty Azure function project, and I'll go ahead and click Create. And at this point in time, what I want to do is just set up my NuGet packages. So I'll right-click on the project and say Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm going to have some issues with compatibility around, Newtonsoft JSON. So one of the packages, the package for Azure Functions, is expecting one version, and then the other packages I'm going to be importing and expect a different version. So what I've found is the best compatibility is to go with like 11.1 or 11.2, sorry, 11.0.1 or 11.0.2. So I'll just pick 11.0.2 and install that. And what that's going to do is upgrade from 9.0.1, which is what the Azure Functions dependency is, to 11.0.2. And when I do that, it'll get a warning saying that I have a version dependency that's not being respected. But in this case, that's fine. I know that's fine. So the next thing I want to do, I could just use CSOM by itself, but instead I'm going to use the PNP core library, which is based on, it's an extension or a wrapper around the client object model. So I'll pick the SharePoint PNP core online package and go ahead and install that. And click OK here and accept. And that'll take a minute to go ahead and install. There, that's done now. And I'm also going to need to use MCell, or the Microsoft Identity.Client library, to authenticate with Azure AD. So I'll go ahead and install that. Okay, so basically all my packages are now there, ready to go. So now I can go ahead and add an Azure function. And I'm going to create a function similar to the one I created in my blog post series, where I'm just going to get list information from a site. So I'm going to right click and choose Add Azure Function. And I'm going to call this Get Lists. So I want to use the HTTP trigger. So I want to trigger this using an HTTP request. And then the access rights, I'm actually going to authenticate with Azure AD, so I don't need the function access rights here. I can just use anonymous. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And that goes ahead and creates the template for the actual Azure function. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the boilerplate code with some code I have pre-created here. So let me just go ahead and grab that. And paste that in here. And I want to use the tenant Rob Windsor test 986. And normally, in this case, I would take the site URL as a parameter. I show how to do that in my blog post series. But just for the purposes of this demo, I don't want that extra code, so I'm going to hard code it. Obviously, I want web parts from different site collections to be able to consume this Azure function. So in a true implementation, I parameterize that. I might even, if I wanted to go multi-tenant, I might even parameterize the tenant name. But for the purposes of this demo, I want to try to keep it simple, so I'll just hard code those things in. I need to resolve some type names just so that Visual Studio can understand these types and give me IntelliSense and compilation checking. So I'll do that for the confidential client application builder, and user assertion. These are from the MSAL library. I want the generic lists, so I'll resolve that. And then client context comes from the SharePoint client object model, so I'll go ahead and resolve that. Okay, so what does this code do? So focusing on this bit here, what we want to do is when the SharePoint framework makes the call to the Azure function, it's going to pass a token. So information that indicates who the caller is. And then what we want to do is we want to exchange that token for a token from our Azure app that we just created. The one that has the permissions, the app permissions, or sorry, when we've configured the delegated permissions to say we want to be able to have all sites.read. So basically, we want to be able to read information from all the different site collections. Okay, so what we'll do is the headers will have the token that gets sent from the SharePoint framework. And we want to use the user assertion contained in that token along with the permission scope request we've made in our Azure app registration to create a new token we can use to communicate with SharePoint. Okay, so we're going to use the acquire token on behalf of with the user assertion from the original token plus the permission scopes configured in our Azure app registration to get the new token. And it's the new token that will attach to our calls in the client object model to be able to then effectively communicate with SharePoint on behalf of the current user. All right. So again, excuse me, we're going to take the token that comes from the SharePoint framework. We're going to exchange that for a token for the Azure AD app that's associated with the Azure Function app. And then we'll use that second token to be able to communicate with SharePoint. And then all we're going to do, and again, this is the same thing I do in the blog post series, is just get the title of all the non-hidden lists within the SharePoint site collection that I've hard-coded up above, and we're going to return those as a collection of strings. Okay, so it's a list, it's a generic list of strings here, but we're going to convert that into a JSON array, and we actually do that down here. So I need to resolve these type names. Let me go ahead and do that. So we'll return the JSON array to the calling code. Okay, so this is our Azure Function app. Now, testing this, I haven't figured out I'm pretty sure you can test this, but I haven't figured out the way to do it. Because what you need to do is to ensure that when you do test it, that you're passing in the token it needs here to exchange with the other token. And if you just run this in the debugger and then try to make a GET request to it, that token won't be there in the headers. I'm sure using like Fiddler and to either first off get the original token and then to pass that off, or using a combination of Fiddler and Postman or whatever technique you can use. There's a way to do it to debug here locally, but that's part I haven't figured out quite yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to publish this Azure function up, and then if there's any issues, we can use Application Insights to find out what those errors are. It's not the best scenario, but it works. But before we publish, we need to set the client ID and client secret of our Azure app registration. So let's go back there. This is the client ID here. So I'll go ahead and copy that to the clipboard and then paste that in here. And we need that client secret that we copied a little bit earlier. So let's go ahead and grab that and then paste that in here. Save everything off. Come back to our Azure Function app, go to the Overview tab, and then click Get Publish Profile. So there are several ways we can publish Azure Functions into an Azure Function app, the simplest way is to use the publish profile. So I've downloaded that. I'll right click now on my Visual Studio project and choose publish. And I'll go ahead and import that publish profile by clicking import profile, going to my downloads, and then choosing the appropriate profile. And now I can go ahead and publish. So what this is going to do is it's going to check to see, what's already up there in the Azure Function app, which is nothing. So then it's going to go ahead and build the DLL that implements our Azure Function app. It's also going to put up any dependencies we have on NuGet packages, publish those things all up to Azure. Okay, so this will take like half a minute, maybe a minute, not too long. So while that's happening, let's go over to this SharePoint Framework web part project. So this is a new SharePoint Framework web part project that I created. I haven't changed anything yet. And what we're going to need to do to tell the SharePoint Framework that we want to call our Azure function is we need to make a web API permission request in the package solution JSON file that lives inside the config folder. So that goes here in this as a property of solution. So I'll go ahead and just add a comma here and then add in the configuration I need to tell the SharePoint Framework that I want to be able to call up to this Azure function. And that looks like this. Okay, so under the in the web API permission requests property, which is an array, I want to say that I want to talk to a resource, and we can actually identify the resource by the client ID, which is fine, but it's not readable, it's not obvious inside of our code what that is. So we can actually also identify it by the name of the app registration associated with our Azure Function app, which is easily identifiable here in our code. Okay, so I'm going to say that I want to be able to communicate with user impersonation. Means I want to use delegated authentication here. So I want to pass that up when I make a request to the Azure function. Sorry, the Azure Azure app registration associated with our Azure function. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that. And the reason why I've done this first is because we need to then publish our SharePoint Framework web part package up into the app catalog and grant that permission request using the SharePoint admin portal. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So first off, I'm here in the right place in this console window, and I'll say gulp bundle -- ship. So that will create the bundle, which is basically the JavaScript that gets transpiled from TypeScript along with the CSS, any other static files, and it gets bundled and minified. So that should be done in a second. There we go. And now I'll say gulp package - solution -- ship. And that will create the actual app package that we're going to put in the app catalog. So that takes a minute. Here, there we go. Done. So now we can come over to, not there, there. So this is the folder in Windows Explorer where I have my, my SharePoint Framework project. And inside of there now, there should be a folder called SharePoint and another folder called Solution. And I can go ahead and just copy that path to that folder in the clipboard. And there is our app package. So now I'll go to the app catalog here, and I'll upload that app package. So there's the one I was working on previously. So this is the new one. And click OK. And just to make it easier so I don't have to worry about installing apps, I'll just say make this web part available across all sites in my organization, and then click deploy. Okay, so there it is there, no errors, so this deploy worked correctly. So now if we go to our SharePoint Admin Center and SharePoint Online and go to the API management page, which we can access from the left navigation here, and just refresh that, we should see that we have a new permission request that's pending approval. Okay, so again, it's the same thing as we saw in that package solution JSON file, where we want to have the permission for our web part to communicate with the Azure function through the Azure AD app using delegated permissions. So I can go ahead and select that and click approve or reject here, and then click approve over here. Okay. Now, once that's done, we can now work with our app in the workbench, the SharePoint Framework workbench. But until that permission request is approved, we can't. So that's why I did that first. And now we'll go ahead and build up our SharePoint Framework web part project in the workbench. And then we'll go ahead and deploy again with the completed version of our web part. So over here in my console window, I'll say gulp serve -- no browser. So we're going to use the SharePoint Online hosted workbench as opposed to the local workbench. So that's why I added the -- no browser switch, which says don't bring up the local workbench because I don't want to work with it. So once we get to the reload step, that means everything is done. There we go. Okay, so now I can come over to one of my sites in the appropriate tenant. And I'll just go ahead and duplicate that tab. And then I'll open up the hosted workbench here. And let's go ahead to our toolbox here. So this is a completed version I was working on earlier. This is the version we're currently working on. So I'll go ahead and open that up. And we can see we just get the standard web part experience. And now we'll go ahead and customize that. All right. So before I do that, let's come back over here to Visual Studio 2019. We can see the publish succeeded. So let's come back over here to our Azure Function app, and let's refresh. And what we should see now is that we have one function in our app called get lists. So basically, we've published the function we developed in Visual Studio to the function app that's going to host that function here in Azure. Okay, so there's our get list function there. So I can go ahead and click on that, and we're going to, we can use this to actually get the URL to our Azure function a little bit later on. But for now, let's come back to our SharePoint Framework web part. And I'm going to go ahead and close this. And let's go to the actual web part implementation here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to add an import. Actually, a couple. Okay, so we're going to be using the AAD HTTP client object to make the call up to the Azure app that's associated with our Azure function, and then that will go ahead and call the Azure function for us. Okay, so we're going to need two types there: the AAD HTTP client and the HTTP client response type. And this import is just making our project aware that we're going to be using those types. All right, so let's start out with something simple. Let's just go ahead and get rid of or replace our render method with this code here, or replace the body of our render method with this code here. Okay, so we want to use the web part context to get an AAD HTTP client object. So we use the AAD HTTP client factory to go ahead and get that. And in the get client, we pass in the client ID of the Azure AD app. So if we come over here to the app, we grab this client ID, we copy that to the clipboard, come over here and paste that in here. Okay, so we're going to create an AAD HTTP client that's going to be able to talk to that app in Azure. And all we want to do is just make sure that we actually get the client, that we don't get some kind of error. Okay, and I believe there's I want to add a loading indicator here, and I forgot to copy that to the clipboard. So up here at the start of our render, I'll say this dot context dot status renderer dot display loading indicator. I want to pass in this dot DOM element as the first parameter, and then just a string here to say what I'm loading. In this case, I'm loading the lists, or I could say list names. Either one is fine. Okay, so we'll display the loading indicator. We'll make the asynchronous call to get the AAD HTTP client, and then we're just going to start up the debugger to make sure that that worked correctly. So I'll go ahead and save. Come back over here to my console window, wait for the process to get to the point where I can actually test this. So once I see a reload that I know I can, come back to our browser, come back to our workbench, and refresh. And I need to start up the debugger, so let me do that. Press F12 and refresh again. Okay, we've hit our breakpoint. So we'll take a look at client, and we can see we have a client with the proper resource URL. All right, so that worked correctly. We're actually able to create an instance of the AAD HTTP client. All right, so that's step one. Now let's come back to Visual Studio Code here and get rid of this bit and replace it with the next step, which is to make a call out to our Azure function. So I'll grab this bit of code here. So I want to put the full URL to our getLists function. So I know it's Azure AD, what did I call it? Azure app, what did I actually call it? I forget. Azure function app test 008. Okay, so I could just type this in here. Azure function app test 008. .azurewebsites.net, and then it's API / in the name of our function. Our function is called getLists. Now, if I wanted to confirm that, I could come back over to our Azure function app, click on our Azure function, and then click get function URL. Right, so I can just go ahead and copy that to the clipboard, close this, come back here, and paste this in here. And we can see that that's the same thing. Azure function app test 008, .azurewebsites.net, API getLists. Okay, so that's the URL to our Azure function. All right, so we're going to get a client for the Azure function, the Azure AD app registration associated with our Azure function, and then we're going to use that to go and call our Azure function. And again, all we want to do here is inspect this response object we get back. Okay, so we're going to put the debugger there, go ahead and do Control S to save, come back to our console window, wait till we see reload. There we do. Come back to our workbench. We have the debugger open. I'll press F5 to refresh. We've hit our breakpoint. We can take a look at the response object. And I just want to make sure we get OK as true. We did. That's cool. and the status is 200. Okay, all good. So that means that our call was successful. All we need to do now is to get the information out of our function call. And that's the last little bit of code here for our SharePoint Framework web part. So I can go ahead and get rid of this code here and replace it with this last bit of code here. Let me just copy all that to the clipboard. And then paste it in. And I think I missed a variable declaration. So up here, I want to say let OK equal response dot OK. Okay. So whether our call succeeds or fails, it'll come into the then, the function associated with then. And we need to check the value of OK. So if OK is true, that means our call succeeded. If OK is false, that means it failed. Right? So what we want to do in either case is we want to use this promise that will give us back the information associated either with the error message or with the list names. Okay? So that's going to be a result. That's going to be any because it could be one of two different things. So if OK is equal to false, that means our call failed. So we'll render out the error information. And the error information will be contained in the result object we get back by getting the JSON. Okay? If OK is true, then that means that the result is actually our list names. So I'll go ahead and create a new variable called list names, which is a string array, and set that to the result. And then what I'll do is if I didn't get any lists back, I'll write out to the UI that no lists were returned. Otherwise, I'll just create an unordered list that contains the list names, and that's this code here. Okay. So we'll use the map function on the array to generate the list item elements inside of the unordered list. And then once we have that, we can go ahead and generate the HTML or the markup for our web part. And really the important part is this bit here, which is either going to contain the text no list returned, or it's going to contain the unordered list with the set of list names. Okay. So now I can go and do one more save here and come back to our console window. There's our reload. Come back over here to our workbench. Press F5. And now we can see the list information coming out of our, basically coming back from the Azure function that we just made the call to. Okay. So let's go ahead, now that we've got that working in the workbench, let's go ahead and republish our SharePoint Framework web part. So I'll get out of the code here. So let's go ahead and do a bundle. And once that's complete, we'll do a package solution, and then we'll go ahead and update the web part package in the app catalog. Okay, so now I'll do the package solution. That takes a few seconds to complete. It's done. We'll come back over to our app catalog. I'll go ahead and click upload. Click choose files. Pick our app package, click open, and click OK. I want to make this the solution available all sites of my organization. Click deploy. When you update an app package in the app catalog, it doesn't check in, so we just go ahead and do that. It's not necessary. I just like to make sure that all my stuff is clean. So I'll go ahead and check in. It's done. Just make sure we see no errors over here. We do. We're good. So now I can go to the pages library inside of one of my site collections in this tenant. And there you can see the Azure Function App Test from the function app I created a little bit earlier. So we'll create a new one. And again, just my pattern is always to keep the names the same. So I'll call the page Azure Function App Test 008. So I'll create a new site page. I'll call it Azure Function App Test 008. I don't want to display the author. I don't want to display comments. And I don't want to display the banner image, just to make things a little bit cleaner. And then I'll go ahead and add the web part to our page and publish. All right, so now that I have that added to my page, I can go ahead and grab the URL, so I don't need the query string. Whoops. Let's just get rid of the query string here. And refresh. Go ahead and grab that and then come over to another user within the same tenant. So this is Christy, which is one of the sample users you can get. And we can see that we're getting the same info. Oh, sorry, this is Patty. My mistake, Patty Fernandez. Again, it's a sample user. If you're not familiar, when you create a demo tenant, you can there's these things called sample data packs, and you can get user information, email information, events. So that's where that demo user came from. And we can see that we're getting the same information here. Now, one thing that when I was preparing this that I didn't really think of is, well, okay, it worked in both cases, but how do we know that these are the lists from, how do we know that it was using Patty's permissions to be able to get the lists as opposed to Rob's over here in this window? So what I would like to do is, instead of using get list, and the reason why I use get list was because it's the same code that I used in the blog post series, is to actually get user profile information. Now, unfortunately, when you do get the user profile information, I just have some sample code over here that shows how to get user profile information using the client object model. The data comes back in this sort of weird format where it's this collection of key value pairs with keys and values. It's not super easy to work with. But using the user profile, it'd be a lot cleaner to be able to go ahead and show that we're, in the Rob web, or when Rob requests the web part, we're getting information using Rob's credentials or permissions. And when Patty or some other user within the tenant does that. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to write a blog post that will be part 4 of the series. So right now we've got 3 parts. I'll make that part 4, where I'll create the Azure function in the way that I've shown you here in this particular Twitch cast. But instead of using get list, I'm going to use the profile information so we can actually see that we're getting the information based on the credentials of the current user. So basically, the delegated permissions are working as expected. But that's what I had, sort of prepared for this particular Twitch cast. So I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I didn't see any questions come up in the chat, but if there are any, if you can type them in now. Really, again, for me, the purpose of this Twitch cast was really just to make sure that everything's going to work, and I'm not really going to be sure until I watch the recording, which will be available in the video section. Also, if the recording comes out as I expected or hope it will, what I'll do is I'll download that and upload it to YouTube as well. So I'll have it both here for, I'm not exactly sure how long Twitch keeps the VODs or the video on demand of each different Twitch cast or session. I'm not exactly sure what what an individual video here in Twitch is called, but however long it will keep the VOD, it'll be available here, and then it'll be available permanently over on YouTube. So for those of you who joined, I hope you found this valuable. And my social media stuff is here, so there you can see below my video. And actually, let me switch to max cam. You can see down here in the bottom right my Twitter handle. So it's at Rob Windsor, and my YouTube handle, which I created long ago, which I somewhat regret not choosing a better name, but it's Toronto Geek. So if you go to YouTube/Toronto Geek, you can see my YouTube videos. And again, the link to the Pate Group blog post series is there in the chat window. So I'll be expanding on that, and there'll be a link to the fourth version part 4 of the series when I get that published, hopefully within the next, well, I'd like to get it published by the end of the week, but it might be into next week before I actually get it published. So that's available there too. So again, if you have any questions or feedback, feel free to ping me on my social medias. Otherwise, thanks very much. Again, I hope you enjoyed this sort of pilot, if you want to call it that, of my my Twitch channel here. And have a great day. Thanks very much.